Evelyn's home stood on a quiet street lined with tall oak trees, their branches forming an archway that shaded the neighborhood in the summer. Her garden was always neat, her porch swept clean, and the white paint of her picket fence never seemed to chip. To anyone passing by, it was the perfect picture of comfort and tradition. Inside the house, Evelyn lived with her grandson Daniel, a teenager who carried an invisible burden. Their lives seemed simple and uneventful to outsiders, but beneath the polished surface of order and calm, a storm was quietly forming. Evelyn had raised Daniel since he was 8 years old. After a tragic car accident claimed the lives of his parents, she became both guardian and authority figure, and in many ways she carried the grief of losing her own daughter, while demanding obedience from the boy she now raised as her own. Daniel had grown up in a household defined by routine and rules. Meals were served at the same time each day, chores were expected without question, and mistakes were often met with sharp lectures that left no room for argument. Evelyn believed she was instilling discipline and strength, but Daniel often felt trapped. He respected her in silence, but he longed for a sense of freedom that seemed to exist only outside those walls. At school, Daniel was quiet but observant. He had a small group of friends who offered him comfort and laughter, though he rarely let them into the deeper corners of his heart. He had begun to understand himself in ways that he knew Evelyn could never accept. The truth of his identity weighed heavily on him, pressing down each time he heard his name spoken in a way that did not fit who he was inside. Online, in spaces where people shared stories about identity and belonging, Daniel found pieces of himself reflected back. These small glimpses gave him hope, but they also made him more aware of the vast distance between the life he wanted to live and the life he was forced to endure in his grandmother's home. Evelyn, in her own world, believed she was protecting him from outside influences. She distrusted modern ideas and resisted change in all forms. To her, strength was found in tradition, and weakness was born from rebellion. She clung to the memory of her daughter, imagining what she would have wanted for her child, and she convinced herself that she alone knew what was best. Daniel's quietness seemed to her like a flaw that needed correcting, and she often reminded him that he needed to stand tall, work harder, and follow the rules of the household without question. She could not see that his silence was not laziness or disobedience, but the struggle of someone hiding a truth too fragile to share. In the evenings, Evelyn would sit in her armchair by the window, knitting or reading, while Daniel stayed in his room. The glow of his computer screen would shine under the crack of the door, as he typed into journals and online spaces, piecing together the identity that gave him strength to keep moving forward. The house was filled with the sound of Evelyn's ticking clock and the distant hum of traffic outside, but to Daniel those sounds only deepened the isolation he felt. He often imagined what life would be like if he could be open, if he could breathe without fear of judgment. Yet he knew too well the sharpness of Evelyn's tongue and the weight of her beliefs. The neighbors saw Evelyn as a pillar of the community. She attended church every Sunday, brought baked goods to events, and checked in on the elderly who lived nearby. People praised her for her resilience, raising her grandson alone after such tragedy. Few ever questioned what life inside that house was truly like. Daniel became invisible to most, a polite and quiet boy who seemed to fade into the background. But behind his reserved manner was a storm of questions, hopes, and fears that grew stronger each day. Evelyn continued her routines, unaware of how close Daniel was to making choices that would redefine his life. In the stillness of their shared home, two worlds existed side by side, bound by blood yet separated by silence, with neither knowing just how fragile their balance truly was. It was late in the evening, when Evelyn went to tidy Daniel's room, something she often did when she felt he was not keeping up with his responsibilities. She noticed the sheets were slightly lifted near the mattress, as though something had been pushed beneath. Curiosity outweighed her hesitation, and she reached under to pull out a small, leather-bound notebook. At first, she thought it was a school journal or a collection of notes, but as she flipped through the pages, her breath caught. Written in Daniel's careful handwriting were thoughts, confessions, and plans that she had never imagined he could hold inside him. The words revealed a truth that Evelyn could not accept. Daniel described himself as transgender, a boy who had been living in silence, and someone preparing to seek guidance and support outside the home. He wrote about how he had chosen a new name for himself, how he felt alive when he imagined being recognized as who he truly was, and how he longed for understanding that he could not find in his grandmother's strict house. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read. To her, these words were not a personal revelation, but a dangerous path that threatened everything she stood for. She felt betrayed, as though the grandson she had raised was slipping away from her control. The idea that Daniel had kept such a secret from her was unbearable, but what shook her even more was the passion and clarity with which he wrote. He was certain of himself, determined to take steps toward a life she could not recognize. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air tighter. She clutched the journal to her chest and sat on his bed, her mind spiraling between anger, fear, and a deep conviction that she had to intervene. From that night on, Evelyn became more watchful. She hovered over Daniel's daily routine, checking his schoolwork more closely, asking pointed questions about where he was going and who he was speaking to. Her suspicion grew with every small action he took. When his phone buzzed with a message, she demanded to know who it was. When he lingered too long in his room, she assumed he was hiding something more. The quiet, which had once been a natural rhythm in their house, turned tense and suffocating. Daniel sensed the shift immediately. Though she never mentioned the journal, he could feel her scrutiny pressing on him, her disapproval thick in the air. The walls of the home began to feel like a cage, the safety of his private thoughts now invaded by someone who saw them not as truth but as rebellion. Evelyn convinced herself she was saving him. In her mind, the outside world was filling his head with ideas that would ruin his life. She told herself that if she acted firmly, she could steer him back onto the path she believed was right. The journal became her silent evidence, a reminder of the secret life she thought she was dismantling. She began cutting him off from his friends, inventing reasons why he could not visit them, or why they could not come over. She limited his time online, insisting it was for his own good. Daniel felt the weight of these restrictions grow heavier by the day, his hope dimming each time a door was shut on his attempts to express himself. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes. Evelyn, once cheerful in conversation, became distracted and distant. She spoke less about her garden and more about the dangers of modern society, hinting vaguely at the struggles she faced at home. Few pressed for details, assuming she was simply tired or stressed. But inside the house, a cold war had begun. Daniel tried to keep his secret life alive in scraps of paper tucked into his backpack, and in stolen moments on borrowed devices, while Evelyn patrolled the home with sharp eyes and a growing obsession. She was no longer simply a guardian, she had become a watchtower, convinced that if she looked away for even a moment, her grandson would slip beyond her grasp. What had started as discovery had now turned into an obsession, and the fragile thread holding their household together was beginning to fray beyond repair. The moment Evelyn intercepted the letter from the clinic, the quiet tension in the house sharpened into something darker. The envelope had been slipped between school papers and advertisements, its plain white surface giving away nothing of its contents. When she opened it, and read the confirmation for an upcoming appointment with a counselor specializing in gender identity, she felt as though her fears had been carved into stone. This was no longer an abstract concern written in a hidden journal. This was action. Proof that Daniel was moving forward with a decision she could not allow. She sat at the kitchen table for hours, the letter folded neatly in front of her, staring at it as though it were a weapon. In her mind, it was not a sign of healing but of corruption, a signal that outside forces were pulling Daniel away from the life she had built for him. That night, The atmosphere in the house was unbearable. Daniel remained in his room, unaware of what his grandmother had discovered. Evelyn paced the hallway with slow, deliberate steps, her thoughts tangled in contradictions. She told herself she loved him, that everything she had done since the death of his parents was meant to protect him. Yet the love she felt was distorted by the rigidity of her beliefs, twisting into something heavy and destructive. She feared losing control more than anything else. The image of her daughter, gone too soon, haunted her, and she clung to the idea that she was preserving her memory by shaping Daniel into the person she thought he should be. But each new piece of evidence, the journal, the friends, now the letter, told her that Daniel was slipping beyond her reach. The revolver entered her thoughts like an unwelcome guest. It had been tucked away for decades, stored in a drawer that rarely opened. Her late husband had kept it, a relic of his military years, and she had never once considered it useful. But now, in the twisted logic of her unraveling mind, the weapon became a symbol of final authority. If she could not stop Daniel with words or rules, perhaps she could stop him completely. The idea lingered, pushing its way into her mind whenever she looked at him, quiet and determined, carrying secrets she could not bear. She began to watch him differently, not just with suspicion, but with a sense of grim calculation. Every step he took seemed to confirm the urgency of what she was considering. The days that followed were marked by silence. Meals were eaten with little conversation, the clinking of cutlery echoing louder than usual in the still house. Daniel noticed his grandmother's eyes following him, heavy with something he couldn't name. He had grown accustomed to her disapproval, but there was a new intensity in the way she looked at him, as though she were searching for the last piece of evidence she needed. He retreated further into his room, clutching the hope of the upcoming appointment like a lifeline. To him, it was the beginning of freedom, a small step toward being seen for who he was. To Evelyn, it was the final betrayal. Late one night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, Evelyn went to the drawer and pulled out the revolver. The weight of it surprised her, cold and solid in her hands. She sat in the kitchen, the weapon resting on the table beside the folded clinic letter. Her mind raced in circles, torn between hesitation and determination. She convinced herself that she was not acting out of cruelty, but of necessity, that what she was about to do was the only way to preserve the family she believed had already been shattered by tragedy. The ticking of the clock grew louder, marking each second as she sat there, unable to set the weapon aside. By the time dawn began to creep in through the curtains, her decision was no longer a question. She rose from the chair with slow, deliberate movements, carrying the weight of her choice into the silence of the house. The breaking point had arrived, and there was no turning back. The morning was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that hangs in the air before anyone has stirred awake. The sun had barely begun to rise, its pale light casting long, faint shadows through the curtains. In Daniel's room, the only sound was the steady rhythm of his breathing, unaware of the storm about to crash into his world. Evelyn moved slowly down the hallway, each step heavy, each breath measured. The revolver felt like an extension of her hand now, the weight pressing into her palm as though it had chosen her as much as she had chosen it. Her mind was filled with a singular thought. This was the only way to stop what she believed was a path of ruin. She pushed open the door to Daniel's room, the hinges creaking in protest against the stillness. The faint glow of dawn revealed his figure curled under the blanket, his chest rising and falling peacefully. For a brief moment she hesitated, her eyes taking in the boy she had raised since childhood. Memories of scraped knees, school pictures, and quiet dinners flickered through her mind like fragments of a life she once understood. But then her gaze shifted to the folded letter she had placed in her pocket. The words burned into her memory, and her heart hardened again. She lifted the revolver with trembling hands, the barrel aimed with the kind of resolve that only obsession could create. The shot rang out in an instant, sharp and deafening, tearing apart the fragile silence of the house. The sound carried beyond the walls, startling a neighbor who had been stepping outside to collect the morning paper. Birds scattered from the trees, their wings beating frantically as though they too sensed the unnatural disturbance. Inside, Daniel lay still, the promise of his future extinguished in the space of a single breath. Evelyn lowered the revolver slowly, her arms heavy, as though every ounce of strength had drained from her. She placed it on the nightstand beside his bed, staring at it as if it were something separate from her, something that had acted while she merely stood by. Yet the truth pressed down on her with unbearable clarity. She had pulled the trigger. For hours, she remained in the house, sitting in the living room with the revolver now resting on the coffee table. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and yet her expression was blank, drained of all emotion. The curtains remained drawn, the clock ticked on, and outside, the neighborhood moved forward with its morning routines. Children left for school, cars pulled out of driveways, and neighbors exchanged greetings, unaware of the horror sitting behind Evelyn's closed doors. She did not attempt to hide what had happened. There was no plan to clean, no thought of escape. The act was final in her mind, and she seemed almost resigned to the consequences. It was the absence of Evelyn in her garden that first raised concern. For years, she had been a fixture in the morning, watering her flowers or trimming the hedges. When one neighbor noticed her porch was empty, a sense of unease grew. Another recalled hearing a loud sound earlier, sharp and unnatural, but dismissed it as perhaps construction or a car backfiring. By midday, the unease had spread enough that a call was placed to check on the household. When officers arrived, the house appeared deceptively calm from the outside. The front door opened easily, and the smell of coffee lingered faintly in the air. The discovery inside told a very different story. Daniel was found lifeless in his bed, his face peaceful, as though he had not even stirred before the end came. The revolver lay where Evelyn had left it, and nearby the journal and the folded letter sat like silent witnesses to the chain of events. Evelyn herself was in the living room, her posture rigid, her eyes distant. She confessed without resistance, her voice flat, almost detached. The officers noted the lack of struggle, the chilling calm that surrounded her, as though the act had been rehearsed in her mind long before it was carried out. Word of the tragedy spread quickly through the neighborhood, sending shockwaves through a community that had always admired Evelyn. People who once spoke of her kindness and dedication were left speechless, unable to reconcile the woman they knew with the crime she had committed. The image of the loving grandmother, shattered overnight, replaced with whispers of obsession, control, and madness. Reporters soon gathered outside the house, their cameras capturing the sight of police cars and yellow tape around a home, once seen as a symbol of stability. For investigators, the case was chilling in its simplicity. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of another hand involved. The story was contained entirely within the walls of that house's, a young life cut short, and an older one destroyed by a choice that could never be undone. What remained were questions without answers, a quiet neighborhood scarred by the memory of a single gunshot, and the haunting image of a grandmother who had turned against the very person she was meant to protect. The trial began months later, drawing intense attention from the media and public. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, activists, and onlookers, each group carrying their own perspective of the crime. Some came to condemn Evelyn, to label her a monster who had destroyed the life of a boy whose only crime was seeking to live authentically. Others came out of morbid curiosity, struggling to understand how a grandmother who appeared so devoted could commit such an act. The small town, once unnoticed, became a symbol of a much larger discussion about prejudice, generational divides, and the cost of silence. Inside the courtroom, Evelyn sat pale and expressionless, her frame smaller than it had appeared before. She wore plain clothing, her hair tied neatly, as though she were determined to cling to a sense of dignity, despite the charges against her. The prosecutors painted her as someone consumed by intolerance, who placed her beliefs above the life of her grandson. They read passages from Daniel's journal aloud, letting the court hear his words of hope and despair, words that revealed his longing for acceptance and his quiet courage. Each entry struck the room with weight, leaving many wiping away tears. The defense attempted to reshape the narrative. They spoke of Evelyn's grief over losing her daughter, her strict upbringing, and her increasing paranoia in her final years at home with Daniel. They hinted at possible mental instability, suggesting that her rigid beliefs and obsessive behavior were symptoms of a deteriorating mind. But no matter how they framed it, the fact remained: she had chosen to take her grandson's life in the silence of their home. The revolver, the intercepted letter, and her immediate confession left little space for doubt. Witnesses were called, including neighbors who spoke of the cheerful woman they once knew and the subtle changes they had begun to notice. Teachers testified about Daniel's quiet resilience, his growing distance, and the light he seemed to find when he began connecting with support outside of home. Friends shared stories of his laughter, his dreams, and his bravery in confiding who he truly was. With every testimony, a picture of Daniel emerged that contrasted sharply with the narrative Evelyn had constructed in her mind. He was not lost, not corrupted, not misguided. He was becoming himself. The verdict, when it came, was delivered to a courtroom thick with tension. Evelyn was found guilty of first-degree murder, and the sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps and murmurs filled the room, not because the outcome was unexpected, but because it made final what had seemed unthinkable. A grandmother would spend the rest of her life behind bars for killing the very person she was meant to love and protect. Evelyn showed little reaction as the words were read. Her gaze remained fixed on the table in front of her, her face a mask emptied of expression. Outside the courthouse, vigils were held in Daniel's memory. Candles lit the sidewalks, and posters bearing his chosen name and words of affirmation lined the streets. For those who had known him, it was a way to reclaim his story, to ensure he would not be remembered only as a victim of violence, but as a young person with dreams and courage. His death sparked broader conversations across the country, drawing attention to the struggles faced by transgender youth and the consequences of rejection within families. Organizations dedicated to support and advocacy cited his story as a call for greater compassion and understanding. Evelyn's prison years became a shadowed chapter, hidden from public view, except for the occasional update from journalists curious about her fate. She lived out her days behind bars, surrounded not by the garden and routines she once cherished, but by walls and silence. The community she had once been admired in moved forward, though the memory of her crime lingered like a scar. The house she had lived in was eventually sold, its walls painted over, its garden replanted by strangers. Yet for those who remembered, the sight of it would always carry the echo of that morning when everything changed. Daniel's legacy endured in quieter ways. His friends carried his story with them, sharing it in classrooms, community meetings, and online spaces. His words, preserved in his journal, were read at gatherings and quoted by those who sought to honor him. Though his life had been cut short, his courage in writing his truth gave strength to others who struggled in silence. His name became a reminder of both the fragility of acceptance and the resilience of identity. In the end, the tragedy was not only the loss of his life, but the reminder of how dangerous intolerance can become when left unchallenged. The story closed not with answers or reconciliation, but with a haunting lesson that echoed far beyond the walls of one quiet suburban home.